Leila Moosa, a senior associate in employment law at Cliff Decker Hofmeyer, is on the line to discuss this matter. Thank you for joining us, Leila. One gets the sense that in the male-dominated corporate world, they know very little traditionally about the disruptions and discomfort women face. Do you think this is still the case?
Yeah, thanks very much, Melissa. So I think it is tricky because historically, women have, of course, been excluded from the workplace to a large degree. And although, we are seeing an increase, of course, there's a massive increase in women's presence within the workplace, actual acquisition, actual promotion, actual retention, it's still, there's still a number of barriers that women face into actually being within the workplace in the same way that men are. And I think this perhaps speaks to, the understanding of the discomforts that one maybe faces when menstruating, as in this particular example. So I think we're coming a long way, and something that's quite indicative of that is the fact that we're seeing increases in recognition of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the public domain, in particular with conversations like the one we're having today.
So we see several countries are beginning to review their HR policies. What sort of considerations should companies take to make this or to consider this policy?
Yeah. So from a South African perspective, we don't have any entitlement to menstrual leave at this stage, and we haven't seen any imminent plans within our formal lawmaking process to actually introduce menstrual leave as an entitlement. But in terms of employers who are considering it, who have seen this within the public domain, and who recognize that from a diversity, equity, inclusion perspective, it's something they'd like to consider, there are a number of steps that they can take. And the particularly important one, I think, is ensuring that the way that it's introduced into the workplace is done properly. So it's a very sensitive topic. It involves matters of privacy, matters of dignity, matters of gender identity and confirmation of menstruation. And it's very important that when it's introduced in the workplace, the purpose of it, which is, to cater for the fact that certain women or certain people who menstruate, which is broader perhaps than just women or people who identify as women, is actually because they experience this discomfort, and that must be alleviated to ensure that they can actually perform their work in the same way that others can.
I understand that in certain countries the government is footing the bill for this leave. Is this also a huge consideration in South Africa?
Yeah, so in jurisdictions abroad, we have seen different types of introductions, whether from a legal perspective or from a policy perspective. And there, some of the jurisdictions have introduced a form of paid leave, where it is on the employer to actually remunerate the employee for the menstrual leave. And in other jurisdictions, it's perhaps an unpaid leave. And there the question would come in from a South African perspective, if it were to be introduced, where would that come from? Would it come from the unemployment insurance fund? Would it then be something in the same way that maternity leave, for example, is unpaid and the unemployment insurance benefits can be claimed? But at this stage, Melissa, it is unclear because it is quite premature, right? There are no imminent plans within our lawmaking process. So actually making those determinations from a South African perspective are quite tricky at this stage.
As I understand, in Spain, for example, you need a doctor's note if you want to claim this leave. Is this also something that could be considered here, but also infringing on privacy?
Yeah, so that is also tricky. I mean, again, it would depend on the nature of the leave if it were to be considered. I'll emphasize that it is premature for me to, comment on that because we haven't seen anything within our lawmaking process. However, if an employee, for example, is going to be taking menstrual leave, it may be that in a similar way to when one takes sick leave and within a certain period, or in particular, one might be required to actually present a doctor's note. It may be that in the same way, menstrual leave is couched in a similar way where one actually needs to provide proof to the employer as to why one is absent. And again, that will only be something that we'll see if we do see this kind of movement within our legal space.
I hear you saying now that it's still too premature for us to be thinking about it in South Africa, but are we talking about 10 years? Are we talking about 20 years? When could we expect something like this in South Africa? Just shortly.
Yeah. So I think it's, from a time perspective, there's nothing imminent. So it would be difficult for me to predict from a time perspective. But from the lawmaking perspective, it still needs to be policy discussions. There still need to be draft bills. There still need to be bills. There still needs to be legislation assented to. So there are a number of processes that would need to be in place for it to become law.
Thank you so much for joining us, Leila. That was Leila Moosa, a Senior Associate in Employment Law at Cliff Decker Hofmeyr. Let's take a look.